My dear students and friends, we are again back with the extension of the CBD, that is the identification and monitoring and under the Convention on Biological Diversity, a deep dive into Article 7, monitoring, identification and the threat management. So, we will be further studying about the identification and monitoring under the convention under the CBD. I am Professor Urusilias, working in Department of Wildlife Sciences and teaching policy also to the postgraduate students. So, this is one of the course we are involved, we are teaching since many years, and in wildlife sciences not only the policy, we have to study statistics, we have to study geography, we have to study history of the environment, and it's a multidisciplinary approach. It's a multidisciplinary. So, today we will be discussing about a deep dive into Article 7, monitoring, identification and threat management. Overview of the Convention on Biological Diversity. This was adopted in 1992 at Rio Summit. The CBD is the first global agreement and address all aspects of biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. Three key objectives: conservation of biological diversity, sustainable use of component, and third is the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the use of genetic resources. We have already discussed there are 40 articles, and Article 7 is very important of the CBD. Article 7 says identification and monitoring plays a crucial role for focusing on identifying and monitoring biodiversity components and process that threaten biodiversity, enable informed decision making. So, Article 7 is very important because it indicates the identification and monitoring. Introduction to Article 7, identification and the monitoring. Purpose of Article 7. The purpose of Article 7 of CBD is to ensure countries adopt procedure to identify important biodiversity components that require conservation, to track activities and processes that may have adverse impact on biodiversity, to enable proactive measures in biodiversity conservation efforts, framework, and Article 7 is closely linked to other CBD articles, especially those dealing with environmental impact assessment, that is Article 14, and information exchange, that is Article 17. So, Article 7 is very important and it is directly linked to the environmental impact assessment, Article 14, and information exchange, that is Article 17. So, key component of Article 7 is monitoring, identification, threat assessment and information sharing. So, what is monitoring? Monitoring means regular and systematic observation of biodiversity to detect changes. Identification, recognizing components crucial for conservation and sustainable use such as species, ecosystem and genetic resources. So, you have to do the monitoring, then the identification, then threat assessment. Whatever you have identified, you have to assess the threat, identifying harmful process like habitat loss, climate change, pollution and overexploitation. Information sharing, ensuring international cooperation and data exchange on biodiversity monitoring efforts. That is the information sharing. So, key component of Article 7 are the monitoring, identification, threat assessment and information sharing. Introduction to Article 7, identification and monitoring. Monitoring biodiversity component. Biodiversity component to be monitored are the ecosystem, species and genetic resources. Ecosystem could be of, we have variety of ecosystem throughout the world: forest ecosystem, wetland, grassland, coral reefs, you name anything. So, so biodiversity component to be monitored are the ecosystem. The forest ecosystem we have to monitor, wetland ecosystem we have to monitor, grassland ecosystem we have to do monitoring, and coral reefs, which are very important, and the Great Barrier Reef of Australia is actually under threat. The species endangered and vulnerable species across taxonomic groups, genetic resources, agriculture crops, medicinal plants, and wild relative important for ecological balance. So, ecosystem, species, and genetic resources are important to monitored. Why do we want to monitor the uh, biodiversity? We monitor the biodiversity to provide a baseline for tracking biodiversity health over time. We do the monitoring to identify changes in ecosystem and species population due to human and natural pressure. One time monitoring is not enough. We have to do the monitoring at certain time interval. Keep on doing monitoring of the species, of the ecosystem, of the biodiversity uh, again and again, so that we know the status whether we are losing or we are gaining. We have to do that. And the third is the indicator of the health. Example include change in species abundance, ecosystem fragmentation, and genetic diversity. If we keep on doing the monitoring, what we have to monitor we know, why we have to monitor we know, if we how we have to monitor we know, and why, because it includes the species abundance. By doing the monitoring again and again, we will be knowing what is the status of the species, what is the status of the ecosystem, whether it is fragmented or connected, what we can do, and genetic diversity, how diverse is the habitat genetically. Identification of the biodiversity component, recognize concept of biodiversity essential for the functioning of ecosystem and human survival, criteria for identification, ecological importance, and the cultural and economic significance. What are the criteria for the identification? The species or ecosystem crucial for ecosystem services like water, purification, pollination, or the climate regulation. Cultural and ecosystem economic significance, genetic resources that contribute to food security, livelihood, and medicinal use. Tools for identification, biodiversity surveys, genetic analysis, and remote sensing to identify and map biodiversity. Establishing inventories, national inventories. Countries are encouraged to develop and maintain inventories of their biodiversity components. Benefits on inventors create a comprehensive catalog of species and ecosystem to inform national biodiversity strategies, serve as reference point for monitoring trends and evaluating the success of conservation measures. Why inventories are important? Inventory creates challenges. It requires extensive resource, expertise, and long-term commitment, and underrepresented region may face capacity challenges. So, these are the establishment inventories. Role of indicator in monitoring. What are the role of the indicator in the monitoring? What are the biodiversity indicators? That is the quantifiable metric used to assess the state of biodiversity over time. And what are the types of indicator? Species population trend, habitat health indicator, and genetic diversity indicator. So, the types of indicators: species population trend measures changes in the abundance of key species. Habitat health indicator actually tracks the extent and condition of ecosystem. Example, forest cover, wetland health. Genetic diversity indicator assess the variability within species genetic makeup. And the use of indicators. What are the use of the indicators? Why we need these indicators? We identified the indicators for the loss again, and then if we identify the indicator, we can facilitate comparison across different ecosystem, regions, and time period, support evidence-based policy decision for biodiversity conservation. So, these indicators, biodiversity indicators, are used for the support evidence-based policy decision for biodiversity conservation. Identifying threat to biodiversity, the major threat we all know why we are losing the biodiversity, the habitat destruction, pollution, invasive species, climate change, overexploitation. So these are the major threats. There are many threats, but these are the major, because habitat destruction means what we are doing. Urbanization, we are clearing the forest for this establishment of the industry or agriculture or the urbanization. Pollution, whatever we are using, we are polluting the environment. We have different kind of pollution: water pollution, air pollution, soil pollution, and disrupting ecosystem. Invasive species, non-native species out competing or preying an indigenous species. If you go to the Himalayas, the pine forest, the pine trees are encroaching over the oak habitat. Pine is non-native species, it's an invasive species. It was planted during the Second World War to have the more and more coal as well as more and more timber. And because of that, the invasive, the pine trees are so successful, they are encroaching the oak habitat. Pine trees contain resin in their needles, and because we extract resin from them, from the stem of the pine, Pinus roxburgii. So the needles contain the leaves in the form of the needles contain the resin, and when they fall in the ground, they make the soil acidic and nothing grows for the animals. So pine trees are not having the much biodiversity because nothing much is available to feed upon. So that is why no species are there. So invasive species are not good. Lantana camara is one of the example. Panthera uh, um, Parthenium is another example. So these are the invasive species which are creating problem to our ecosystem, to our environment, to our biodiversity. The climate change, altering habitat migration pattern and species distribution, or exploitation, unsustainable harvesting of species for food, medicine and trade. So these are the major threats, and the impact of the threats are the lead to loss of species, ecosystem degradation and reduced ecosystem services. So threat assessment and prioritization process determine which threat poses the most significant risk to biodiversity based on severity and scope. Focus on vulnerable components, prioritize threatened species and fragile ecosystem that are highly susceptible to human induced pressure. On the basis of the threat assessment, we have to develop the action plans, implement the strategies to mitigate identified threats such as habitat restoration, invasive species management and strict pollution control. Monitoring for early detection of threats. Before it is too late, we have to do the monitoring much before. That is why continuous monitoring at time interval is important. Early detection monitoring program should be designed to identify emerging threats before they causes irreversible damage. Benefits of early detection enable proactive management to prevent biodiversity loss. For example, tracking illegal logging or poaching activities using real-time satellite data, early identification of invasive species, and then the global early warning system. Collaboration between government, research institution and conservation organization to develop global alert system for biodiversity. National biodiversity and biodiversity monitoring. National monitoring program. Countries are responsible for establishing and maintaining national monitoring system aligned with their biodiversity strategies. Every nation has to ensure maintaining the national monitoring system aligned with their biodiversity strategies. Regional approach, many biodiversity challenges such as transboundary pollution, migratory species conservation and marine system requires regional cooperation. When it is migration, the species doesn't bother about the political boundaries. They just cross the political boundaries and they are using the overlapping habitat. So in that case, if we talk about the marine ecosystem doesn't bother about the political boundaries. So in all these issues, we need the regional cooperation. An example for the regional cooperation are the African elephant database, track population across Africa to inform conservation efforts, Amazon Cooperation Treaty, collaborative monitoring of biodiversity in Amazon basin. So these are the example for the regional cooperation for the biodiversity conservation. Tools and techniques for monitoring, technological advantages. There are many tools and techniques we are advancing day by day. Satellite imagery and GIS useful. These geospatial data are useful for large scale habitat mapping, deforestation monitoring and land use change detection. The satellite imagery of the two time period like 10 years or 15 years apart, two satellite imagery can give us the can detect the habitat, can detect the changes in 20 years, in 30 years. So geospatial is a very important this thing. Satellite imagery and GIS is very useful for the change detection, remote sensing, track ecosystem changes without detect direct contact, important of in inaccessible regions. Traditional field method. So the traditional field methods, biodiversity surveys, camera traps on wildlife. Biodiversity surveys, ground level observation, species inventories and habitat assessment. There is no alternative of the biodiversity survey, the ground level observation, because directly you are seeing the species individual without involving um, any equipment or any modern this thing. So camera trap and wildlife monitoring, if we are not able to do the direct survey, usually we use the camera trap. So camera trap can work in absence of the human being. It can track animal population and behavior in wild. Innovative approaches, environmental DNA, which is also known as the eDNA, allowed for species detection from water, soil or air sample without physically observed organism. Data collection and data management, tools and techniques for monitoring we have just completed, and now data collection and data management. So data collection is very important. These are the tools we have just discussed. What are the tools through which we can collect the data, and now management of the data, standardizing of data, ensuring uniform data collection protocol to enable consistent comparison across region and over time. So if we are going to collect data to assess the biodiversity laws, biodiversity threats, we have to collect in a very systematic way. The data sheet should be prepared much before going into the field or using the equipment to collect. So ensuring uniform data collection protocol to enable consistent comparison across region and over time. Data management system, countries must develop robust data management infrastructure to restore and manage biodiversity data. For example, National Biodiversity Database, regional repository and global platform like the Global Biodiversity Information Facility GBIF. However, there are challenges like data sharing, countries doesn't share the data, the nations doesn't share the data. Transparency, there are not much transparency, and capacity building remain challenges for many countries, particularly in the global south. Importance of public participation in the data collection, in the biodiversity conservation. The public participation is very important because they are the part of the biodiversity. So role of indigenous and local community. Indigenous community often possess deep knowledge of local ecosystem and species. Integrating their traditional knowledge can enhance biodiversity conservation effort. Citizen science, we are too much into the citizen science, especially when we are talking about the bird counting. So in that, what you have to do, involve voluntary biodiversity monitoring through species count, photographic evidences and local surveys. Platform like iNaturalist and eBird have made significant contribution to biodiversity database. So if you are talking about the urban biodiversity e-database, eBirds is a very important platform where we collect data throughout the world. For example, community-based conservation program in Kenya, where local knowledge is used to protect wildlife and habitat. Definitely locals, those who are living inside or around the natural resources, are more aware as compared to the people not living in that area. So international cooperation in monitoring, importance of global collaboration, biodiversity threats such as climate change, pollution and overexploitation are transboundary issues requiring coordinated international responses. Cross-border monitoring initiatives, Convention on Migratory Species. Cross-border monitoring initiative means the species which are using the boundaries, crossing the boundaries, there should be some regulation. So, Convention on Migratory Species is one of such convention which facilitates cooperation between countries to monitor migratory species and manage threats like habitat fragmentation and climate change impact. So, if birds are moving from one country to another country, there are some stopovers. So, we have to ensure the habitat and the climate change impact. Joint conservation effort, there are bilateral or multilateral conservation agreement focusing on shared ecosystems such as Coral Triangle Initiative in Southeast Asia. Coral Triangle Initiative in Southeast Asia. Sharing information and best practices, information exchange. The CBD encourage the exchange of biodiversity data, research and best practices among countries to foster collective progress in biodiversity conservation. Biosafety clearinghouses, BCH, that is called BCH, an outline platform created under the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety to facilitate the exchange of scientific, technical, environmental and the legal information about living modified organism, LMOs. Best practices examples, successful reforestation projects, wildlife protection laws and eco-friendly agriculture practices that can be replicated in other regions. Addressing knowledge gap in monitoring, challenges in monitoring, data gaps. Creation ecosystem species or regions are under research, making comprehensive biodiversity assessment difficult. Capacity gaps, many developing countries lack the necessary infrastructure, expertise or funding to implement extensive monitoring program. Strategies to overcome gaps, capacity building, training local scientists and conservationists, improving funding mechanism for biodiversity research and monitoring, because without funding it is very difficult to do the monitoring and the research. And there are global supports, international funding initiative like GEF, Global Environmental Facility, and partnership with academic institution can help bridge the gap. So, we have identified the challenges like data gaps, capacity gap, and we have overcome with the gaps by capacity building and global support. Adaptive management based on monitoring data. What is adaptive management? A flexible management approach where policies and conservation strategies are adjusted based on new data and insight from ongoing biodiversity monitoring, for example, protected area management, fisheries management. Protected area management means expanding or adjusting boundaries of protected areas based on a species migration pattern or habitat degradation. Fisheries management, modifying fishing quotas based on real-time data about fish population and marine health. And the importance is enabling government to make evidence-based decision that keep pace with changing environment condition and emerging threats. Conclusion and the way forward, the summary is the effective identification and monitoring are key to the success of the biodiversity conservation under the CBD, and monitoring biodiversity component, recognizing and mitigating threats and collaborative globally is essential for halting biodiversity loss. So, identification and monitoring biodiversity components, and the future focus on enhanced cooperation, embracing innovative technologies for monitoring and increasing the involvement of indigenous communities and the public. Strengthening global effort is crucial to achieve the CBD's objective in an era of rapid environmental changes. This is the future. So, focus on enhanced cooperation and strengthening the global effort. So, thank you very much for patience listening of my lecture, and we will be meeting again soon. Thank you.